Great. So hi, everyone, and welcome to this We All Citizens webinar. Really excited to speak on this topic today to better understand the practicalities of how to actually move beyond GDP. And this is obviously a very important piece of We All's work because we're trying to urge countries to undertake alternative measurements. And there's a phrase of you manage what you measure. So this will hopefully sort of give us an introduction of different ways to understand how we can better manage or better measure our economies. So for some context, Rutger wrote a We All briefing paper back in November called Measuring Wellbeing, Moving Beyond GDP. So I'll share that paper and the link to that in the chat. And he also gave a talk that was a brief overview of this topic. And then he also has a book called Replacing GDP by 2030. So I'll share these links for you all just as a different resources that you can have. And then, as I said, this webinar will be recorded, so you can find it on our YouTube page. And this will also hopefully be helpful as it's going to be dense content today. So you might want to go back and check it out. Yeah, but thank you all for being here. And I hope that you enjoy the session and learn something new about how we can support governments in moving beyond GDP. And Rutger, I'm going to have you take it away.
Yep, thanks, Isabel, for the introduction. Let me just share the slides. So hopefully, Isabel, can you just let me know if you're seeing these slides at the moment?
Yes, all good.
Great. Okay, hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be here for the second talk. Last time I gave a broad brush impression based on the policy brief that we wrote for We All on this intriguing topic of how do we move beyond this powerful metric in society. But what you do notice in those kind of discussions is that we kind of skirt over the details of measurements of the systems that have been proposed in the past. And yeah, I've been working on this topic for a very long time, so I have quite a broad view of the things that have been done in the past. And I would love to share also this, this knowledge with the We All group, and also discuss specifically, how do we move forward. I've worked on these topics with the OECD and World Bank, European Commission, and so I've seen a lot of these things. My general, sometimes people will tell you which of these indicators is best. You provide an overview, and then you argue, well, this is generally the best indicator that we have. You'll probably find that that is not the direction that I take it. I like to show, the variety of methods that are out there and also their strengths and weaknesses. And then from that, I do want to try and create some kind of synthesis to see whether we can actually harmonize more of this thinking. So today's is actually a fairly simple setup for the discussion. What I will not be discussing is what is wrong with GDP. I think this is something that's sometimes a bit frustrating, that you always have to start these discussions with that question. But I think for this audience, and also given that we had that in the previous webinar, I'm basically not going to say what is wrong with GDP. I want to go more towards what is already being done. So which beyond GDP alternatives are there? And we're actually going to go through the top 11, I would say. These are the 11 Beyond GDP initiatives that you really need to bluff your way through a Beyond GDP discussion, I would say. If you have a grasp of these 11, then, I think you're very far in understanding the many, many, many others that are out there as well. But I don't just want to give you an overview. I also want to try and convince you that there is actually a commonality between these various indicator systems. So I will be working towards a synthesis actually of these various initiatives. And then the second part is also, yeah, the action part. You know, what exactly can we do to move forward? As Isabel said, my book is called Replacing GDP by 2030. You know, what exactly would we need to do to really get to such a situation? And I think that's also where hopefully we have a lot of interesting discussion. Now, I do want to warn beforehand, I have had a look at my slides again, of course, in preparation. It is quite a dense presentation, especially the discussion of the 11 Beyond GDP initiatives. I think quite a lot of science, a lot of names, a lot of literature will be covered. And if you are new to this topic, I could imagine that it is slightly overwhelming and perhaps difficult to follow all of the arguments that are being made. I mean, for each of these 11 initiatives, there is, you know, hundreds of scientific papers to back them up usually. So it is quite a dense presentation today, but you did sign up to a deep dive. So that's also what you're going to get. I have tried to make it as accessible as possible, but I think the great thing about having the recording is that perhaps it is actually also something that would be useful to actually also view a second time to really, you know, hear all the arguments, I guess, that I'll be making, because it is quite a condensed presentation. So with that warning, I would really like to start. So these are the 11 indicator systems that I think actually provide a fairly good overview of the situation that we have at the moment. So for the last 50 years or so, there have been all types of developments, and in my estimation, there are actually hundreds of individual initiatives all over the world. But I think these 11 really, you know, cover, from a methodological point of view, cover just about all of them. So I want to go through each of these individually, one slide only, so don't worry, it won't be a huge presentation, but I also want to work towards a synthesis. And to actually get towards this synthesis, I think we just need to refresh our definition of sustainable development. As we all know, I think in 1987, the Brundtland report came out with the definition, you know, sustainable development meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And quite often in the literature, people will interpret this as three parts. They will say there is the social aspects to sustainable development, there's an environmental aspect, and there's an economic aspect. And these need to be, you know, developed in a harmonized way. I actually think from the scientific perspective, an alternative which has been suggested is to more look at it from another three-part splits, which is the current generation, as the, you know, the definition clearly states that we need what we do in our generation, the well-being that we have in our generation shouldn't compromise the ability of future generations. So those are two very distinct dimensions, I think, of sustainability, of sustainable development. And the third aspect, which is really important in the Brundtland report, is of course the equity discussion. So disparities within countries, so inequalities with the billionaires, the 1% and the rest of society, so to speak, but also between countries, so the global south and the global north. So you will see that these three notions play a very significant role in the 11 indicator systems that I'll be covering. So let's get started with the first indicator, the first Beyond GDP indicator, and that's called the Genuine Progress Indicator. And usually if you see overviews of Beyond GDP, they'll generally start with this indicator. It's actually existed in various forms since the early 70s when it was proposed by Nordhaus and Tobin. two Nobel Prize winners. And it's very much the economic response to the criticisms of GDP. So I'll just go through a simple example, which is based on, loosely based on some Belgian data. What the Genuine Progress Indicator does is it doesn't start with GDP, because GDP actually measures the production of an economy. And the Genuine Progress Indicator basically says, well, it's better to look at the consumption of people, because that has more of an influence on their well-being or their welfare. So they start with personal consumption expenditures, everything that we spend in shops and elsewhere. Then they add and subtract things that are not actually included in GDP. So one of the things that they add to it is the fact that household work, so the households work that we do, cleaning the home, cooking, those kind of things are not included. Care for our family members or others is not included. And what these economists do is they actually create a monetary value of that activity. So they actually estimate, the well-being effects of this household work, which is usually not measured in GDP, or which is not measured in GDP. So a lot of, for example, feminist economists have been arguing that this really should be part of the normal GDP measurement. This should be a core of the way that we measure an economy. Now, something that, for example, is not in GDP either is the environmental damages, for example, to the climate. So there again, we look at the emissions, for example, from the economy. We put a price on those emissions, so the damages that will be created, and then we subtract that from the personal consumption expenditures. Similarly, if inequality grows, then that's damaging to the overall welfare of a society, and there are methods to create a monetary value for that. And I could go on for much longer. There are many more components. But in the end, what is done is that all these additions and subtractions are actually added and subtracted to the personal consumption expenditure to actually give you the Genuine Progress Indicator. So in this case, I think this was, as I said, this is loosely based on some Belgian data. And so where the consumption expenditure is actually 92 billion, the Genuine Progress Indicator for that year is actually lower because of the damages, for example, to the environment or increases in inequality. Now, I think I showed you in the last presentation as well. What this does is create quite a powerful visual. This is some work that also Wheel fellow Bob Costanza did together with others in Nature, where they tracked GDP from 1950 to 2000 and beyond. And you see that GDP has been growing all that time. Now, if you calculate the Genuine Progress Indicator for that period, then you actually see that progress has been stagnating since the 1970s or so. So I think that's a very powerful visual of progress. So the strengths, I think, of course, I mean, this figure speaks for itself. It's a very valuable communication. I think we should also respect the fact that this type of work has been going on for since the early 70s, so for 50 years. So there is a long scientific tradition in it. From a critical perspective, monetization is not very good at certain well-being dimensions. So, valuing your friends, your family, your partner, a lot of those things that, are very influential in terms of well-being are very poorly measured or don't actually have methods to measure it in money. So there are many well-being dimensions that you could think of that are, very difficult or impossible to measure in monetary terms. And the second aspect is that I think monetization does a very poor job when it comes to long-term future. So climate change, biodiversity losses, I think those impacts are actually underestimated because of the methods that are used in these monetization techniques. So that's the first indicator. I would say a large part of the economic community, works on this and does that. A second really important one that you'll see in the literature a lot is the so-called Stiglitz report. I'm pretty sure that if you've done any reading on Beyond-GDP, you'll have heard the Stiglitz report. So it's interesting just to have a look at what different perspective this had. The origins are that in 2008, President Sarkozy of France, he asked Joseph Stiglitz, but also Amartya Sen, also another Nobel Prize winner, and a group of huge, very influential economists. He asked them, well, if GDP is not the right way to measure the economy, and they all agreed, well, what should we do? How do we change if that's the case? And there's many, I think, really worthwhile conclusions in the report. Two that I think are very important and endure are that this is the first group of economists that proposed a dashboard. They basically said that monetization, as is done in the genuine progress indicator, that they do not agree with that, and that they think that there should be a dashboard of indicators so that all the various dimensions of life should be measured in their own units. And a second really important point that they made was that you need to separate current well-being and future well-being. So similar to this sustainable development definition of Brundtland, they really said you need to separate these two dimensions. Saying something about the present and the future are two separate things. Now, the Stiglitz report is very influential from a thought perspective, but what people don't realize is that there's actually no suggestions in terms of what that dashboard would look like, or a suggestion on how all countries should measure it. So there were some follow-up projects that I'd like to mention. The first is a joint UN OECD Eurostat task force that was really based on the Stiglitz report. And full disclosure, I was actually the chairman of this report. So, full disclosure. And what this task force did was try to work out this thinking into dashboards. So 3 dashboards were suggested, one for the here and now, so that's well-being of the current generation, one for later, and also one for elsewhere, so our impacts on other countries. And to illustrate this theoretical framework, I have a chart here, or a figure, which shows you, the simple economic model behind this thinking. Basically, there is the now, the current time, and there is our resources that we call capital. And from this capital, we can create consumption goods, but we also create human well-being. And quite often you'll hear people say, well, there is natural capital, produced capital, human capital, social capital. So it's a very broad concept. And then we actually give a certain amount of this capital to future generations. So, the nature that we leave them will be also critical. The amount of machines, of human infrastructure, human capital, education, all these are things that we leave to future generations. And future generations will have to build their well-being from these capital stocks. So what the task force or the SES recommendations do is that they say, well, we need one dashboard to measure the here and now. And there is a definition of various dimensions like material consumption, health, education. And we need a dashboard for later, so which tracks sustainability of produced capital, human capital, social capital, and natural capital. So I think the strengths of this system is that it's backed by a very impressive group of economists, the Stiglitz report. There's a clear link to economic theory, while at the same time not just adhering to mainstream economics, but also to broader economic theories. Criticisms of dashboards is often that it's difficult to communicate. So if you have 40 indicators, for example, of well-being in the here and now, what is the bottom line of that? And also dashboards have been, that space of the Beyond-GDP debate has started to become dominated by the so-called Sustainable Development Goals, which is the next one that I'll be discussing. And I'm going to assume actually that I don't really need to talk about this too much. I think this is probably the Beyond-GDP process that is best known in the world. There's this global process where all governments have agreed. There's no scientific basis, but all governments have agreed on the priorities that we want to solve before 2030. There are 17 goals. There's, I think, 169 targets or so. So a very broad dashboard of goals and targets that we're trying to achieve as a global community. And I think that, of course, is a huge strength. It's unbelievable how much uptake it has had, not just for governments, but also businesses and other stakeholders, NGOs. I think there's many people that have really to which it really resonates. At the same time, you could ask yourself, well, what exactly is the overall goal then? Is there some kind of analytical framework where we can say what the actual goal is, or what will the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, look like after 2030 if there's no basis? And also something else that's important to policy, what are the relationship between all of these things? All these topics, education, gender, economy, environment, they're all interrelated. And if you want to create good policies, you also need to know about the relationship between all of these things. So instead of going through all 11 of them, that's probably a bit too much. I just want to take a short pause to just stress this synthesis perspective. What we've heard so far is 3 initiatives. So one is the Genuine Progress Indicator based on welfare economics. We heard about the Stiglitz report, which is based on a broad economic framework, I would say. And we've heard about these Sustainable Development Goals. And there are actually quite a few really prominent names also involved in these initiatives. And the names in bold are actually names of Nobel Prize winners. So this is a field where a lot of great thinking has gone into this work. And what I want to stress today is that if we look at it from this 3-part split, so well-being, sustainability, and equity, then that helps us to kind of categorize these various initiatives. So the Genuine Progress Indicator actually doesn't distinguish between these 3 dimensions. So it's actually an index of basically all 3 domains. Now, the Stiglitz report, I think, is one of the most forceful reports to actually argue for this split. So they say, no, you should not mix these different dimensions. You should really have a dashboard for well-being, a dashboard for sustainability, and a dashboard for equity. And then the Sustainable Development Goals also do not make a split between these 3 dimensions. And they also don't have a conceptual or theoretical framework. So keep that in mind as we're going through the others, because now I want to focus on Beyond-GDP initiatives that are focusing on well-being only. So these are initiatives that are only aimed at measuring current well-being, the next 4 that I'll be discussing. So the first one is the OECD Better Life Index. And just to set the scene, it's very much based on the Stiglitz report. And it's based on this here and now concept, so human well-being at the current time. And what they've done is they've actually identified, again, 11 domains, and within those domains they've identified various sub-indicators, and then from those indicators, they produce an index, although quite often they will say that they're a dashboard. So they are kind of an index and dashboard morphed into one. Now, in terms of strengths and weaknesses, what I really like about the Better Life Index is that you actually get to choose your weights. So you can actually, when calculating the index, you can say, well, education is most important to me, or environment is more important. So you can actually create your own Better Life Index, which I think is a really innovative way to present it. And I think what the OECD does really well is also focus on inequality. So what are the inequalities in housing, in health, in life satisfaction? I think those are really important aspects. Again, in terms of the criticism, what is the end goal? If you have all these indicators, all these domains, what exactly, when would a policy be successful? Given that there'll always be trade-offs. And also this issue that I also mentioned at the SDGs, what is the relationship between these various indicators? So actually the Better Life Index is a dashboard, but there are also a number of indexes for well-being. And the first one I would think that a lot of you have also heard of is the Human Development Index. And it's something that the UN has been promoting for a very long time, actually since the beginning of the 1990s. And it's based on work by Amartya Sen, another Nobel Prize winner. And basically his theory, I think from a philosophical perspective, is really interesting. He says there's a difference between functionings and capabilities. So functionings is the life that you actually lead. So your consumption, your life, your free time, the life that you lead is what he calls functionings. But then he says, what's also important is the life that you could lead. Do you even have the capability of going to school? Do you have good healthcare? It's okay to look at what actually happens to people, but it's also good to see what capabilities people actually have to improve their lives, even if they chose it. And he says, actually, we should be focusing more on the lives, how good a life could be, and taking away the restrictions of those lives than at the actual lives themselves. So an important critic, I think, of welfare economics, and a philosophically very interesting concept, I think. At the same time, if you look at the way that it's been operationalized, this is the Human Development Index for this year. So you'll see here that Norway is the top. And you'll also see that there are 3 subcomponents to the Human Development Index. There's life expectancy, so there's a health component to it. There's an education perspective to it, so there's 2 indicators for education. And there's also basically a GDP type indicator. So I think from the rather complex philosophical notions that Sen presented, this is quite a dumbed down version, I would say, of his thinking. He did condone of it, and he did also realize that indexes were powerful. And just from a how do they do this? How do they actually add these things? Well, what happens is that you have these indicators of life expectancy, of education, and of GDP. Because they are not actually in the same units, one is measured in years, one in years of schooling, one in money. you need to actually do a mathematical transition to an index, which you then translate into the Human Development Index. So there is a mathematical process that you need to go through to calculate this. So from a strengths perspective, I think from a, it's a very interesting philosophical dimension to the debates. Also interesting is that this year they published a planetary pressure HDI. So they've also tried to expand this towards sustainability type questions. From a weaknesses perspective, I do think the richness of his thinking is far greater than than the Human Development Index itself. And this mathematical weighting is, of course, also a bit of a drawback. You would hope also that from a theory you would have some other way also of weighting these various domains. Now, the last two indexes are based on survey questions. This is something that we usually call subjective well-being. And that's basically measuring the happiness or life satisfaction of people all across the globe, actually. So a typical question would be, on a scale from 1 to 10, can you indicate to what extent you're satisfied with the life you're currently leading? And a score of 0 refers to complete dissatisfied, and 10 to completely satisfied. And there's many variations of this, and I've put down there the OECD guidelines on measuring subjective well-being, which go through all the conceptual and theoretical aspects of survey design and those kind of things. And this is used a lot. So, for example, the World Happiness Report, which is shown below, that really uses this notion of asking people about their life satisfaction. And this, again, is really good when it comes to, ranking countries, for example. This is the ranking of the World Happiness Report, where Finland scores, I think, 7.8. You'll generally find that Scandinavian countries are usually score really highly on these type of metrics. It's useful for showing country rankings, but it's also useful for showing time series over time. So in terms of strengths and weaknesses, actually there's a very long tradition in this type of measurement. Measurement in the United States, for example, started just after the Second World War. So it actually has a longer history than, for example, the Genuine Progress Indicator and economic type approaches. There is definitely global measurement, and statistical offices are even starting to do this. Of course, there is this issue, can this question really capture well-being? How fit are you yourself to actually answer a question, give your life a grade from 0 to 10? I mean, there are some questions of whether you can cognitively really assess at that level. And also, how do you then influence that? How could you actually affect with policies that score? I think that's also an open question, which is a drawback, I think. So that gets me to the last well-being index, probably one that very few people have heard of, but it's secretly one of my favorites. It's been created by Daniel Kahneman and Alan Kruger. Daniel Kahneman is also a Nobel Prize winner. He's a psychologist, and they have basically they say, if you want to know about the well-being of a person, why don't you have a look at the 24 hours in a day? Look at what activities they do, look at what they like and what they don't like. So in this table, you'll see the activities, you'll see the positive effect, so the ranking of how much you enjoy it, and you'll also see the amount of time that you spent on these activities. It was a very small sample size, I must say. And as you can see, things that we generally on average don't really like is commuting. That's an awful thing. Working doesn't score very highly. Even taking care of my children actually always surprises people that that's so low, actually. And on the top, intimate relations, sex, socializing, relaxing, meditation. You know, a lot of the things that I think we would say do definitely impact our well-being a lot. And if those are not covered, then I think it does affect our well-being significantly. So I really like this approach. And Daniel Kahneman and Alan Kruger, what they say is they could have made a weighted index of time and this well-being score. So where you have an average sort of well-being over the day. But they actually say that might be very different in different cultures. So they actually say, why don't you look at the amount of time spent on unpleasant activities? So if there is, if you are not appreciating certain activities, then we would like to scrap those activities, or those are the unpleasant activities. And they feel that this is, from a cultural perspective, easier to compare between countries, for example. So I really like this approach. What I like most about it actually is that it relates to people's experiences. Everybody has a 24 hours in a day. Everybody has these activities. Everybody spends, appreciates them or doesn't. And also from a modeling perspective, time is a variable that you could model to 2030, to 2050. You could think about, how many hours will we be working in 2030, for example. So time, I do think, is, from a modeling perspective, an advantage. Now, the reason why you'll probably not see this very often is that it's really, really expensive to do time use measurements. And also from a conceptual perspective, you could also argue that not all things that are unpleasant are bad, right? If you are studying for an exam, it's probably not the most exciting thing to do, but it is still a good thing to do. So focusing just on unpleasantness doesn't really capture, whether something is bad by definition. So we've now covered the first three, which were more general in terms of covering all three dimensions of well-being, sustainability, and equity. We've now covered four approaches that cover really well-being in the here and now. So current well-being, where the Better Life Index was a dashboard based on economic theory. Human Development Index was by Sen's capability approach. Subjective well-being is from social science. And the U Index is also from social science, from a hedonic psychology perspective. And again, notice that there's a lot of really prominent names involved in these things, Nobel Prize winners that have been, involved. So I do think very valuable that all these perspectives are in our community. And now for the last four, I want to focus on indicators that for sustainability. So there are also a couple that focus squarely on the future, that really want to provide a measure of the future. Now, the first is the economist perspective. So let's again return to this, this graph of capital and well-being. The argument here is that, future generations will have to deal with the resources that we leave them. So the produced capital, the human capital, and the natural capital, as well as the social capital. So if we want to say something about the future, we have to think about, how these capital stocks are developing. And I've put a some results up. This is from a World Bank report called the Changing Wealth of Nations. So on the top row, you'll see groups of countries, because they have these results for over 140 countries. And then you'll see the type of assets, so produced capital, natural capital, human capital. So the way to think about this is if you think about your own life and somebody said, please sell everything that you own. So sell your house, your books, subtract your mortgage, everything you own, you have to sell. What would be the value of all those things that you were selling? And in a sense, that's what this type of research is doing. It's saying, what if a country sold all the assets that it had? What would be the value of those assets all put together? And the answer for people, I'm assuming that a lot of people in the audience are from high income OECD countries. So I've circled the green number. So actually the answer is that each of us are worth on average $708,000. So if we sold everybody in our countries and all the land and machines and infrastructure, it would be worth around 700 grand. And if you look at what the breakup is of that, you'll actually see that the largest part of that is human capital. So 70% of that number is actually embodied in ourselves. So the skills, the education, our economic production capacity, that is actually 70% of this value. So to a certain extent, we would be selling ourselves. Now, the produced capital, which is the machines, the buildings, the infrastructure, those are worth around 28%. And actually, natural capital is not that large of a part of the high-income OECD countries. While you'll see that for the low-income countries, they have a much lower wealth per capita, but they also have a much higher natural capital share in those countries. Now, a lot of great work is being done by the World Bank in this respect. Full disclosure, I'm actually working with the World Bank at this moment on the next edition of the Changing Wealth of Nations. There is also work by the UN Environment Organization called the Inclusive Wealth Report, which also publishes this type of data. Strengths, weaknesses. I think it's fabulous that we have these global databases. It fits really nicely with our current conceptions of GDP and of national accounting. In terms of weaknesses, I do think there's a real sustainability problem that I never interpret this as sustainability. Climate change is not included as a capital stock. So you don't get any notion of climate change. And even when biodiversity is actually included, there is no real notion that there might be a collapse in the future. And even if there is the collapse in the future, it's generally valued very in a very small way. So I don't interpret these numbers as real sustainability in the sense of will future generations be able to survive or thrive. Now, the next three are three other sustainability indicators. One very popular, I think, very well known as well, stemming from the 1990s, which is called the ecological footprint. And what that basically does is it relates our consumption of energy, our settlements, timber and paper, and food and seafood. It relates those to land area. So it asks itself, how much land do we need for all this consumption that we are engaged in? So it compares the land to our consumption. And what is really communicatively powerful about that is that it can then also say that basically this consumption is exceeding a limit. The US consumption is about 5 times the amount of land that it has. So it is exceeding these limits that, the planetary or the ecological limits or of the biocapacity of the United States. And this consumption is over the top. So I think very powerfully communicatively, many of you might know that every year there's an overshoot day, which indicates at what day every country actually overshoots their own biocapacity. So I think, for many countries that's around August or even July, that they've actually exceeded in terms of their consumption, they've exceeded their biocapacity. I think it's really powerful that it's linked to our human consumption so that you can actually also see how it relates to you. But there are theoretical criticisms. Not all land is real land. There is also fictive land where, for example, all the energy that comes from fossil fuels, that emits CO2. And then basically in the calculation, what you say is, well, how many acres or hectares of forest will have to be planted to actually replace all that or to capture all of that fossil fuel emissions. So, that's a very inherent reason why this threshold is over, is reached or even exceeded. Now, this idea of a limit, so that our environment has a limit, has also been proposed by some scientists that look at planetary boundaries. So basically they say, well, I think there are 8 domains which they identify. So 8 planetary systems. And for each of those planetary systems, they look at a limit. Can these systems actually survive beyond a certain threshold? So again, there is this limit thinking. And this is, the visualization that they have, that there are certain things that are definitely beyond the limits of these planetary boundaries. So I think just from a strength weaknesses perspective, very good in terms of communicating what the real problems are. I think it's also good that natural sciences have a say in what sustainability is. I think, as I said, economic perspectives, I don't really view as giving a very good answer to long-term sustainability. So natural science thinking, I think, is very important in this realm. At the same time, the authors, if you look at Rockstrom, the foundational paper on this, they do actually say that it's very difficult to really define from a scientific perspective a certain threshold. So it's not an easy scientific task, but I think it is something that's very important. And it's actually something that in the last index that I want to cover has been used. So I think a lot of people will know about Donut Economics by Kate Raworth. And she uses the planetary boundary system to actually define the outer limit of her donut, so the ecological ceiling, she calls it. So the outer layer is the planetary limits. But what she has done is she's added to that the social foundations. So she also said we shouldn't just look at the planetary limits, but we should also look at the social thresholds. There are also limits below which humanity should not drop in terms of supplying their well-being. So she's basically used this planetary boundary concept and added this social dimension also to this thinking. Strengths, weaknesses. I think it's been great to see how that work has taken off. It's a very communicative way. You might say, well, what really is the end goal? I think in the description usually it says, well, we need to be within the donut, but within the donut there are still very many possibilities. So can we also make a more perfect donut? Is there an optimum? I guess is the answer. I do know that there's a lot of experimentation with policy. How could this be applied in policy? That's, I think, something that does need to be developed. And as I said, for the natural limits, that it's hard. I think also in the social domain, it's also very hard. What are the thresholds below which humanity should not want to be? I think that also is a very difficult discussion to have. It's an important discussion, but I think we also need to be honest from a scientific perspective that it's not an easy task. So I've covered the 11 ones. I hope there are still people that are grasping these things. As I said, it's probably good to maybe if you're new to these things, to have a second look at the video once it's out. I want to finish before we go to what can we do beyond this summary. I just want to finish with the synthesis. I do think it is valuable to look at all these initiatives from this three-part system. So this definition that comes, I think, ultimately from Brundtland, but which was also strengthened by the Stiglitz report, that we need to make a distinction between these three dimensions of Beyond GDP, and that we have so many insights from so many scientific fields. Many prominent economists, many natural scientists, social scientists, Nobel Prize winners. So we have a very rich community, and I think if you can understand these 11, you're very far in your understanding of the whole, the whole lexicon of indicators. So I think it's probably a good moment to have a little question and answer time. I do see that there has already been a bit of chats, and I don't want to be broadcasting all the time. So any just questions we have before we actually go on to, what can we actually do to bring this agenda forward? I think it would be good to just have some interaction at this stage. I do realize it's a bit dense, what we've been discussing.
Yeah.
Isabel,
Yeah,
do you
sure.
have you?
Stop sharing your screen just for 1 second so we can see
Yep, sure.
files. And then we had a couple questions in the chat, so maybe we can start there. Andrew, you had asked a question, and I'm not sure if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask. And then if anyone else has a question, if you want to just put a little Q or type the word Q into the chat, then I can call on you. Yeah.
Sure, happy to. Thank you. Fascinating talk. I was just curious, with respect to the one graph, Rutger, that you had showed around the progress indicator, which kind of clearly flatlined around 1970, and GDP obviously increases, and just kind of my armchair observations around that's also seemingly when you had a lot of debt creation, credit creation, monetary policy changes kind of globally, which led to a variety of, I think, seemingly chasing short-term yields, overspending, use of plastics, like all these things kind of seem to me to be tied to perhaps changes in monetary policy, which affected the price of money and interest rates and all these things. So I don't know, is there, in your mind, any kind of correlation between monetary policy and how that changed around that time period to kind of the lack of prosperity and growth? And I don't know, it seemed to me that there perhaps could be. So I'm just curious for your thoughts.
Yeah, it's a very complex question that I think, you'd have to look at the underlying data more closely. In terms of if the monetary policy did actually lead to higher consumption or, for example, higher debts and higher consumption, consumption-based or debt-based consumption, then that would actually be an argument that the genuine progress indicator would actually increase as well, because the consumption expenditures are still actually part of this, part of the calculation. The explanation that's usually given by the people that do these calculations is that this generally is because from the 1980s, environmental pressures really started to ramp up. They actually started already in the 1970s and even earlier. And inequalities as well, generally speaking, in the US, for example, and a lot of OECD countries, 1980 is also kind of the time that inequalities really started to rise. So the explanation that's usually given when interpreting the Genuine Progress Indicator is that these are the environment and inequality increases are really the drag on this progress indicator, while consumption has increased, right? So that's actually a reason why the Genuine Progress Indicator, if it hadn't had all this inequality that's the reason why GDP has been expanding. So I do think it would need a longer discussion on what monetary policy might influence, but generally speaking, inequality and environmental pressures are mentioned.
Thank you for that.
Amanda, do you have a question you want to ask?
Yes, really enjoying this. Thanks so much, Rutger. This is fantastic. I wanted to ask a question around sort of communication and understanding of indicators. So I think one of the major challenges with GDP and a lot of sort of the economic measurements is that normal people don't really know what they mean. Yeah. And so as a result, there ends up being a lot of just faith in the narratives that are presented without real understanding of what they mean. And I see in a lot of these movements a sort of a continuation of this where, for example, I think many times like the social capital or natural capital kind of languages that are brought in, I don't think is very intuitive to a lot of people. And so I was just wondering, like, from your perspective of the kind of frameworks, I mean, I know you said the U one, like the U sort of framework you liked because of that more intuitive aspect. But like, do you see that as sort of a big part of the consideration in these? And which one do you think it would be easiest to communicate with a general populace about why this performance matters,
Yeah.
that means for them?
Yeah, it's true. You'll get people that say, well, money is the only thing that really resonates. And I think in government and in businesses, that's quite often the case. But then if you're talking about the citizens in general, then sometimes money becomes really abstract. It does lead to some narratives which I nearly always get in presentations, like GDP is really objective and it's measurable and it's it's well defined, and then you tell them you can't actually view the economy when you out of your window. It's just a convention that after 400 years we agreed to measure in a certain way. And if you're talking about growth, economic growth, you actually need to know the quantity, quality, and the price changes of every single product and services in the economy to really measure economic growth. And that goes for government services, it goes for Apple iPhones, it goes for apples in the sense of the tree. So that is not the robustness that people generally view it with. I don't think is actually is true, but it is a narrative which is in society. And this is the reason. So the point that you're raising is, should we also look at indicators that are most relevant to people's lives? And that what I've found about the U index is that it really resonates with audiences. So when I'm doing this talk, it doesn't matter whether I'm doing it for scientists or for citizens, everybody has a 24 hours in their day. Everybody has certain activities during that day. Some people work more, some less. Some appreciate their work more, some less. Some hate their commute. Some go by bicycle and love it. Everybody has an opinion. When I put that table up, I can guarantee about 10 minutes of discussion with ease, right? And to me, that's also what you're saying. It resonates with people. People can understand that the statistics are part of their lives, basically. And I do think that's a very powerful thing. And I think time use is undervalued because it's just so expensive to measure time. But when Keynes, probably the most influential economist of the last century, when he was actually asked in 1930 to envision society 100 years later, his actual vision was based on time. It wasn't based on money. It wasn't based on goods and services. It was based on time. And so I think time is a core aspect of our lives, and it resonates with people. So I am a fan, but at the same time, as you've seen from my presentation, I realize that I don't think there is a perfect Beyond GDP indicator, and we should be looking at the insights from all of these things rather than just saying this is the way to go. But I like your point, because I do think we need to resonate with society in general.
Thank you. Do you want to dive back into your presentation or do one more? We have like one more question.
Well, yeah, it would be good just to have one more clarification question or a question of, and then I think in the moving forward, we'll have even more reason to discuss.
So Vivian, you've typed a question in the chat. Do you want to come on the screen and ask? I think I pronounced your name wrong, and I apologize. But I can also read the question aloud. Okay, I'm going to read the question aloud. So she writes, an index I like to use in the work I do as a volunteer are the dimensions of Dr. Machteld Huber, MD, has developed on positive health to show the value we add to society, because the value we add is essential for economics. No volunteers is damaging for a city, region, country. Is there an international standard, not GPI, to measure positive health?
And so I guess this is also measuring volunteer work or health. Well, there are, so if you're just looking at the subdomain of health, I do think there are a lot of initiatives also looking at, can you summarize health into some kind of index? I'm not an expert on those, but, that's just one domain of well-being. The first aspect of the question was on the volunteer work, which I think is also really interesting, since it's not part of GDP. And to give a value to that has actually been a discussion for many decades. Actually, people have been advocating that this should be part of the way we measure the economy for a very long time. And I am actually part of an expert group that is discussing the next system of national accounts. So GDP will be revised in 2025, and the whole system of national accounts will be revised. And one of the subgroups that is in that will actually be discussing also households, production and work and volunteering and those kind of aspects. Now, I don't want to get everybody's hopes up in the sense that people will think that in GDP in 2025 will have changed and that households, services and volunteering work will be part of GDP. But there is momentum to at least measure those aspects and at least make them consistent to GDP measurements. So it is good to follow that work. And I think it is encouraging that the people that are revising the next SNA are conscious of these things. And people like Nancy Folber, who are very prominent feminist economists, are actually part of this process of revising the next system of national accounts. So cautiously optimistic that there'll be more discussion of this. I don't think GDP will be adjusted for these type of measures in 2025.
You want to, yeah, perfect. So that's what we've got for questions as of now. And if you want to share your screen again.
Great, yeah. Okay, so yeah, from this overview, I'd like to discuss, how do we move forward? Isabel, just to indicate you are seeing the screen?
Yeah, all good. Thank you.
Great. So a great richness, I think, in terms of sciences, also possibility to actually see a synthesis, that these things are not as different as they sometimes seem. So I think that's an important message that I'd like to send. So, how do we move forward? What I want to say, so how to move forward. So there is a general tendency you will see that basically many people will go towards the content of these indicators. So there's 11 of these, and there are actually even more, but and then they'll start arguing over some of the major debates that we have. So one of the really contentious issues is whether you are for an index or you are for a dashboard. This is heated debates you can have over this, and I've had in the last 15 years, I've had these debates loads of times, and you'll get index supporters who say, well, GDP is an index, so obviously what we're looking for is an index. And to communicate effectively to society, it's just really, well, basically a bit naive to think that anything else but an index is what we need. And you'll have dashboard supporters that say, well, you just can't add up all these things in life. It's just absurd to add these things up into an index. So you should not go where science basically doesn't let you go. So we need a dashboard of indicators. So this is one of these debates, and people are very adamant that if we solve this debate and we, either we come into the index camp or the dashboard camp, then we will have solved the issue. Another really contentious issue is whether we should monetize social aspects. Should we monetize, give a monetary value to nature? Can we monetize climate change? And basically, there are people who say, well, absolutely not. Monetization really sucks. And these economists are just ludicrously real idiots. And there are obviously also people, economists usually, that says, well, let's face it, money talks in this world. And we know these methods are not perfect, but we'll work on them, and just get over this monetization aspect. So this is again a major debate that you will, if you follow the Beyond-GDP discussion, you'll have seen this for the last 50 years or so. Another thing is, do we need a scientific foundation? All the things that I've mentioned, except for the SDGs, have a scientific foundation. But there is also quite a large group that really wants this to be a democratic kind of bottom-up type process. So they don't actually want a scientific foundation. So, let the people decide on what well-being and sustainability is. And these scientists are top-down imposing these theories. And then a scientist would say, well, we've investigated all these things and summarized the people's feelings. And, if only society would start listening to us. So very much a top-down, bottom-up kind of discussion, and whether you need science or not. And actually, even more often than not, I find that there isn't actually even that much debate. Basically, what happens is that the people that are proposing these indexes, they say, my GDP indicator is the best. It's clear from the theory or the literature, and let me explain why that is. And then, there's a whole underlying theory of why that's the best indicator. And basically, a lot of the debates are predicated on the assumption that if we solve these things, then problem solved. Society will then shift either to an index or a dashboard. It'll be monetary or not. It'll be scientifically based or not. Then basically we're done, right? So that actually sounds pretty doable. But yeah, in my experience, I really am skeptical whether this is where the solution lies. And that's also why I don't really like infighting about these debates, because I don't really think that this is where the problem really lies fundamentally. Where I find some evidence for that is in the New York Times. I'm doing quite a bit of research on the New York Times, and the gross. This is the amount of articles that are referencing these various indicators, for example. Some are economic, some are indexes, some are dashboards, some are scientific, some are not. So all the variants are there. And you see that gross domestic product is mentioned about 6,000 times in 10 years or so. So about twice a day, I would say, twice in every edition of the New York Times. And things that people get really excited about, like the genuine progress indicator, which is really popular amongst economists, actually was only mentioned once in the full decade. So, you can have all types of scientific debates about how wonderful this economics is, how much monetization is, how good an index is, but apparently that is not really a crucial success factor. But the same could be said about a dashboard like the Sustainable Development Goals. I mean, that's really popular in our community, but it's only been mentioned like, I guess, a dozen times a year since 2015 when they were instigated. So I really think we have a problem that is a little bit larger than just identifying from these 11 which is the best indicator and then just agreeing on them. And that is that, to me, GDP is just the tip of the iceberg. And what's really the entire iceberg is this economic thinking. Now, I don't want to make a caricature of economics. Economics is a widely heterogeneous group of theories, and I myself am an economist, an environmental economist. So I know about the very broad science that we call economics is actually sometimes too much of a caricature in the Beyond-GDP world. But at the same time, I do think we need to recognize that there are, of course, more dominant streams, more mainstream aspects of economics, which I think are very dominant in our society after the Second World War. And I've tried to distill what are the 4 things that economists do really well. What have they done that is so appealing basically for our society? And in the end, I think there are 4 things that are crucial. So economists have a really appealing narrative, which is in the education of economists, it's in policies, it's in the media, and it's a very easy to understand narrative. The first aspect is, of course, the economy is important. So, with every economist that's on the news, you also get the impression that the economy is important. It's something that we should focus on. The second aspect is, of course, this rather positive assessment of economic growth. So growth is generally something that is positive, and a recession is something that is negative. So that's a very deep narrative, which I think is in very many, which is very much ingrained in our media, in our science, and all these things. So I think, economics has a very powerful and appealing narrative. Second thing they have is that they're very harmonized in terms of the language and the terms, and the terms that they use are just very well globally coordinated. So the system of national accounts is an accounting system which defines all the core concepts of the macroeconomy. And that's a huge achievement, to have a scientific community speak in a coherent language is, I think, a huge benefit to economists. The third aspect is that economists are so fast economists have a wonderful logistical infrastructure whereby they produce GDP figures every quarter. So after every quarter, there's a GDP figure, and it's published around a month after a quarter ends. So it only takes a month to produce these statistics. And actually statistics on unemployment, jobless rates, inflation, those are even more frequent. So economists are really well organized in terms of generating really fast statistics. So it's not strange that journalists really like this, because economists create news. They have new statistics. And the fourth aspect, which I think is really powerful about economists, is that they provide advice about the future. They don't tell us only about the problems that we have, or things that we should worry about, but they also tell us about how we can solve them. They have models, they have tools in which they actually describe how to create more economic growth. They might be focused on the wrong thing, in the sense that economic growth shouldn't be the goal of society, but they do make the life of decision makers really more easy, because it's very difficult for decision makers to make complex decisions in complex times. So economists, they cater to these needs of policymakers. So that leads up to the project that will be starting at the UNU. And oh, actually it doesn't. That's the next slide up. What I wanted to say is that, there might be other things that economists do really well, but we need to really be, cognizant of the fact that economists have kind of captured the popular attention. So this is again from the New York Times, and it's the percentage of New York Times articles that are referring to a certain scientific profession. And so, for example, the green line is the amount of scientists. And in the 1920s to 40s, scientists were referred to about, under 1% of the articles in the New York Times. And what you actually see is that scientists and experts have become more powerful in our media, or at least that's my interpretation of this graph. But what you see is that actually economists are a fairly unique group in this sense. Economists are referenced just about as much as all scientists. So the generic term scientist is just about as prevalent as economists, while we know that science is a hugely heterogeneous body of disciplines and schools, but economics is a very important, if not the most important subunit of that of science. And the strange thing is we've been becoming far richer in this time. So actually the economy has exploded in an aggregate sense after the Second World War. So you might actually argue that from a scientific perspective, at least the aggregate of our wealth is no longer really the problem, at least in the Western world. And we should be focusing far more on climate scientists, on people that understand inequality, because that is a problem. But on the other hand, we are, there is this very important scientific field of economics, and GDP is only part of this story of why economists are so popular. And I think they're rightly so. As I said, I think they do really have a couple of really unique selling points. And as I said, I'm an economist myself. So I wanted to, for this UNU project, I've for the next 7 months, I'll be working with colleagues at the United Nations University on a project that we call the WISE transformation, where WISE stands for this well-being, sustainability, and equity dimensions. And we want to try and see whether we can beat the economists in their game. So economists have this appealing narrative, they have a common language, they're fast and frequent, and they give advice about the future. So what would happen actually if we got those 4 moonshots goals, if we put that in a wise, in a well-being, sustainability, and equity perspective? I don't know if everybody's familiar with the term moonshots, but it refers to the fact that I think it was Kennedy or so that said we will be going to the moon, and they didn't know how they were going to do it. But it's important to give a vision of, this is the direction that we need to take, and then afterwards ask yourself how you're going to do that. So let's just think about these moonshots. So firstly, we need a wise narrative, one where well-being, sustainability, and equity is important. So we need to stress all the time that these are the goals of society. Then we also need to stress that if you don't simultaneously grow well-being, sustainability, and equity at the same time, then actually it's not yet progress. It's only progress if you make progress in all 3 of these dimensions at the same time. We need to create a common language. We have far too much terminology. So in this moonshot, we have the goal of creating a system of wise accounts where we define all these core terms that are in these all these various systems. We need to be much faster. Environmental data is very often really slow. Social data is sometimes even slower, and sometimes time use, for example, can be 3 years behind the dates. So we need to be faster than GDP. And we also need to help policymakers make decisions. We need to make sure that we have models and tools that tell them about what will well-being look like in the future, what will sustainability look like in the future, and what will equity look like in the future, and what can you do as a policymaker to actually make that happen. So we need to help policymakers relate to the future. So each of these moonshots, I think, are vastly complex and, of course, very ambitious. But I think it's important to set these 4 goals in the sense that these are some of the core reasons why economists are rightly very popular as advisors to our society. They have these 4 things that are really good, and if we want to compete, we really need to compete on all these 4 aspects. Now, in the how to achieve these moonshots, loads of research into why narratives work, the psychological aspects, also something that I discussed today with the UNU. Are there gender biases also in the terminology and in the models that we have? In terms of synthesizing a common language, I think we need to look at all the accounting systems that are already out there. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. Also looking at how we can synthesize a lot of these indicators that I presented earlier. Fast and frequent indicators. I think we really need to be open to big data sources, open data platforms, and also nowcasting, where we kind of combine modeling and statistical processes. And in terms of advice about the future, also we need to create these models that are giving us advice about well-being, sustainability, and equity. And I think we should also not just do that at the government level, also at the company level, we would think about how that would actually look. And even at the citizen level, you see with personal footprint calculators, for example, there's a large demand for citizens to also understand, what impacts are they having? How can I live a better life? But at the same time, I'm cognizant of inequality and of sustainable development. So rather ambitious goals, very much, I think, also very consistent to the policy brief that we published for the We All community. And I think from both sides, you and We All are very anxious to work together. And so the final slide is, any ideas or that you might have on ways to contribute, or ways in which you think this agenda can be taken forward, that would be much appreciated. Some of the things that I was thinking of, the vision of the synthesis that I showed you, is something that, that's the vision that I would envisage, but I think there's many other ways of looking at it. Do you have particular expertise when it comes to these moonshots? Are you a big data expert or open data expert? Funding possibilities is, of course, also very welcome. We do have a basic project funding at UNU, but we definitely don't have funding to really for all those 4 moonshots, we're calling them. But we do have 3-year funding for kind of a basic project. But we are also looking for extended funding. And I do think actually it would be great at some stage to have a collaboration with the WeGo governments. I think these are the governments leading, of course, in this field. And it would be very interesting to see whether, the outcomes of this project and this process might be useful to their needs. That is the end of my presentation, Isabel. And so I'll stop there. I'm very happy to start the discussion. You're on mute.
Sorry, that would be good. Thank you so much. That was really informative. A lot of information. I also caught myself taking some notes here myself. Yeah, so with a couple minutes left, if anyone has a question, if you want to just put a Q into the chat, or I see Luis, you have your hand raised.
Yep.
Go ahead.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, Rutger, it was fantastic. I really enjoyed it. I'm Luis. I am the founder of the World Happiness Foundation. And actually, I put on the chat that we have created running on AI, on artificial intelligence, a whole observatory where you can actually track real time any news around the world. We are tracking 22 million media, and maybe that can be something that you can use. Of course, it's for free. It's for free, and you can track, and you can actually compare different words and terms, so you can actually do in real time GDP, GNH, OECD, whatever. So
this is exactly great. I think I have looked at it at some stage, but it would be great to be in contact, because this is exactly what I mean, right? We need to be faster than the economic statistics to really appeal to journalists, and to really, it's fabulous. Well, with probably not so nice to go into details now, but please, can we maybe we could have a bilateral talk at some stage, and that would be fabulous. Yeah,
absolutely. And we're actually planning the agenda for World Happiness Fest, which is around World Happiness Day, March 20th. And we have a whole day focused on public policy and governance. And we actually normally partner with We All. So we love to connect and talk further about that, because we need to raise awareness. And that week is very important, to raise a bit more awareness about well-being and happiness. And actually going beyond GDP is part of the agenda. So yes, let's please connect.
Yeah, great.
And we'll love to support. I don't know if we have enough funding, but at least we can give you some tools that you can use for the project.
Yeah, I think also the thinking that you have in terms of how can big data be structured towards these kind of phenomenon, I think that's really important mindset, because a lot of statisticians still have the mindset is I'm going to create a survey and then, statistically process it. But I think it's really valuable. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Lovely.
Congratulations.
Yeah, we're going to go a couple minutes over, so hopefully you all can hang on a little bit. Laura, I'm going to call on you to ask your question next.
Cool. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah, great. So thank you so much. I admit to only coming in halfway through, but that was so helpful. I'm slightly glad I missed the first half because I think my brain might have exploded. So I work in
Sorry
the.
about it.
I know it's good. I work for an MP in the UK Parliament, and kind of so. And my question is, I suppose, which one of the 12 options, if you were put in charge of like a national finance ministry, would you push in terms of what is most readily to adopt? Because I guess one of the concerns that I have, I mean, I'm not saying it's not really important to analyze all the different options, but in terms of political action and change, if you say, well, we actually need to wait a bit and analyze lots of options, it can easily translate into a message of, actually, we can't change anything at the moment, let's stick with what we've got. So if we were, in terms of making a really compelling case for starting with something, even if it's not perfect, because it's going to be a lot more perfect than GDP in the system we've got. If we put you in charge of, I don't know, the UK Treasury or something like that, which one would you go for, and why?
Yeah, but I wouldn't focus on measurement. I wouldn't actually talk about measurements. I would focus on the policy tool. So what those policymakers are probably really asking is, how can I make a decision that's beneficial to well-being or sustainability, and which concepts would be most useful in that sense? Because I think the UK has done a lot of work on well-being, for example, so that's readily available. There's loads of environmental accounting. So it's not really a matter of that the data is not there, and I have my personal preferences or feelings, but I actually think the real problem in policymaking is this aspect of the modeling, of giving advice, right? We know climate change is a problem. We know biodiversity is a problem. We know there's groups that are problematic in terms of their well-being. So I would actually advise the government. So, for example, the Budget Commission, I would advise them to build a decision-making model to actually see, well, how could we create, for example, this budget based on well-being? And New Zealand is an example, of course, of this, that everybody knows, that they've created a system of how to create a budget based on well-being. So I would not focus on retrospective statistics, but rather on a decision-making tool going forward, because that I think is where there's too little research. There's too much research on retrospective statistics and too little research on future-oriented policy decision type things. But then if I would build the model, so if you would get me in charge of that model, then what I would build, it would be, so if one criteria is if it's readily available, then you would, I think, go towards the subjective well-being measures, or perhaps a dashboard of indicators such as the Better Life Index. Personally, from a conceptual point of view, as I said, I really like the U index, but that's really expensive and it's not readily available. So that would be a different criteria. So for the well-being perspective, that would be my choices. And I think we need a choice for each of these three domains. So we need a choice of well-being. And so there's the Better Life Index, the subjective well-being, or the U index, as far as I'm concerned. Then there's the domain of the sustainability. So what are the future prospects for future generations? There, I think planetary boundaries, I think, are a very obvious choice. I'm not very fond of these monetary ones because I don't think they're really long-term sustainability indicators. And the third one is equity. You could use the work of Piketty, who's been doing, of course, a lot of work on income and wealth inequalities. I do actually think there's a really great project at Oxford, I think it's called the Measures of Poverty, where they look at multidimensional poverty, because poverty is not just about income and wealth. It's also about educational poverty. Time poverty is actually also something, health poverties. And they look at multidimensional poverty indexes, which I really like, because it also broadens the discussion towards non-income and wealth type discussions. So if you were forcing me to choose, then that's the choice I would make. But I wouldn't do retrospective statistics. I would build it into a model that helps the Budget Commission create a decision-making tool.
I'm going to have one little add-on. Someone asked in the chat about the New Zealand well-being budget. So I thought that sort of fits. I'm not sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I've had a lot of contact with the lead economist at the Treasury, so I've been really fascinated learning about the the ins and outs. How do they do that? How do you create a well-being index? And because they've identified their priorities. So they've identified the Maori population as being, needing help in terms of their well-being. They've prioritized mental health. They've prioritized children in disadvantaged families. So they've used an indicator system to identify these areas where well-being needs to be processed. Then the second step that they did is then they created a budget, which is not assigned to a certain ministry, which I think is an interesting innovation. And so ministries have to compete over, what's the best idea to actually help Maori? What's the best idea to help mental health? What's the best idea for children in disadvantaged families? And the third dimension is that you then need to quantify, what effect you think you'll have on the well-being of these particular areas. So what I think is so fascinating beyond the headlines of well-being that, of course, New Zealand gets is to actually learn about that this is pioneering work in the sense that, every budget system has a cogs and wheels that start turning, and they've really innovated in terms of which decision-making tools and stuff are working. And so that's what I find fascinating, but that's also where all the pioneering really needs to go in. I do think there's possibilities to improve on, those kind of systems. They haven't, when I talk to the New Zealand, this chief economist, he's very, honest in the sense that this is a great first start, but it's not as if now we have this entirely sussed and we know what a well-being budget looks like. I mean, they have developed great stuff, but it's early days, I think, in terms of the technocratic aspects of creating a budget.
Fantastic. Thank you. I think that's going to be our last question that we'll take today because we're a bit over time. So just to close on Weall's end, and then Rutger, I'll pass over to you. But thank you all so much. This was just a really rich discussion. And Rutger, you have a beautiful balance of being brilliant and also be able to explain things in a very easily understandable way. That's not common, and so it's a very impressive skill. I thank you for sharing
Thanks.
your brain.
It's been a pleasure to discuss it. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, and we'll connect. Outside of this, I'll have the recording up on YouTube. Rutger, a couple people have asked for your slides. So if we could maybe get a PDF, I can put that on a link to the website, and I'll put it under the YouTube page. And if you have any questions, my email is isabel@weall.org. And then I can be sort of a conduit so that Rutger's email isn't flooded.
But feel free to reach out. I think this is a kind of a global collaboration, so I'm happy to answer any emails. It's just that my email address is a bit difficult. So it's hoekstra@metricsforthefuture.com. So otherwise, we might add it to the, or it's in the slides as well. So feel free to reach out.
Rutger, will you hang on just for 2 seconds?